So, does the U.S. have something to fear, broadly speaking, as this unfolding situation continues to evolve in Syria and the region?
Of course, but U.S. interests very much rely on two fronts. Well, actually, three, if you want to look at it this way: Iran, ISIS, and the continued construct of not wanting a heavy Russian influence in the Middle East until you have an absolute 100% stable capacity. We cannot let our guard down.
December 7th, to be exact, we saw the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. What does that represent to the United States, our global interests, and what does that represent to our military? To answer those questions today on Bets and Badges, I have the honor and privilege of introducing Anna Caney, professor who was in Doha, Qatar, for Doha 2024 during the day that the Assad regime fell. Let's bring her in. Anna, how are you?
I'm doing good this morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, for the benefit of our audience, tell us about Doha 2024 and what you were doing, and what were the reactions specifically of the world leaders and the Middle Eastern leaders when the Assad regime was toppled?
Okay, well, a little bit of context. I am a professor of history. I specialize in the Middle East. My primary focus is actually Iran. I attend the Doha Forum every year. It is a global network of getting together scholars, academics, diplomats, journalists, world leaders to discuss the major issues that are going on, not just in the Middle East, but in Africa, in Asia, and the relationship with the West, very distinctly and a lot of times. I was there very specifically to sit in and was working with panels on Syria, panels on what's going on in Gaza. And it was during the Syrian panel on December 7th, which was also being filmed by Al Jazeera Network for a show, that information started coming in about what would then go on overnight with the fall of Homs and then taking Damascus. At that time, while we were in the panel, when these started coming in, that Assad had fled the country, you could palpably hear reactions from the audience. There was a lot of sighs of relief. There was a lot of shock. There was light applause from individuals. And overall, from the individuals on the panel, there was an immediate, cautious, very cautious optimism. The reason for that being that the individual who led this with HTS, Gilani, has known and is very much affiliated with Al Qaeda, but over the past years has been able to turn himself from what, not my words, basically from a terrorist into a technocrat.
Mm-hmm.
And so we currently have a situation within just those 2 days, going from December 7th, when the announcements first started coming out, to what was going on December 8th, with the reactions from world leaders at the conference. As how do we now approach what is actually going on in Syria with the major players, with the potential outcomes and the problems that are going on. Backing up to December 7th on that day, while we were meeting, they very rapidly changed around some of the forum so that Russia, Turkey, and Iran could meet literally in the next room to discuss the situation. What they said on December 7th, off the record, was that they would not interfere with the will of the Syrian people and the aspirations of the Syrian people at that time.
The losers here, according to news outlets and a lot of people that are in region, are calling, are the Russians, Iran, Hamas, and the groups like Hezbollah, right? Um,
Yes.
what were their reactions? Did you have Russian leaders there? Let's take with Russia. Did you have Russian leaders in the conference, in the forum? And what were their reactions to the fall of the Assad regime?
Lavrov did speak the next day, and Turkey had a press conference the next day. The Iranian foreign minister, who was supposed to be speaking, did not speak. He was taken off of the speakers list for the conference. Yes, absolutely. Russia and Iran are the current losers in this situation. Iran had strategic failure in its approach to supporting the Iranian proxies that were in Syria, as well as Hamas, Hezbollah. Russia is a major loser as the largest supporter of the Assad regime. And when Assad left, they are not only politically cut off from Syria, they are also physically cut off.
Strategically, the Russians had bases in Syria, right? That gave them access
Yes.
to the Mediterranean.
Yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
And they're now losing that control.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they were. This is putting both Iran and Russia on a back foot. They're going to have to back up and then reform their strategy. For other players in the region, whether you're looking at Turkey is really the big winner out of this.
Yeah, I wanted to get to Turkey next after we talked about the losers here.
For Iran, they're very cool players, and regardless of whether you our feelings towards the Iranian regime, they are very cool players, and they are going to step back, and they are going to look and heavily and carefully calculate what they are going to try to do next. With regards to losses. Now, you have compound things going on here, of course, with Israel, because the Iranian proxies are also being dealt with Israel as well as in Syria. And so with that, the Russians are basically going to play the same game. What is the next objective goal that they can perceive that will bolster their interests in the Middle East?
Let's introduce the winning faction that now takes over the rebels, if you will, the HTS, led by Mohammed al-Jilani, who has dropped I guess he adopted that name because he's from the Golan Heights, and he adopted Jilani in reference to Golan, but now he's back to his birth name, which is Ahmed al-Sharat.
Yes, well, Jilani is of probably a little more interest here than the whole idea of HTS, which actually doesn't even appear till 2017. Is that the reason that Jilani is not a immediately popular player with the United States is that he was directly connected to Al Qaeda in Iraq and was very much responsible for engagement by Al Qaeda and terrorist organizations against U.S. troops in Iraq. He then actually had a dispute with those leaders and separated from them, and then took on his roles in Syria, coming in and then eventually developing HTS with that. Now, he, in that state, was actually had a bounty on his head by the U.S. government for close to $10 million. This is where diplomacy and what comes in is because what do you do here? The main goal in any of this right now is going to continue to be regional stability. Before Assad's fall, which was very unexpected, by the way, there was a stagnant situation going on in Syria. Everybody was fairly okay because there wasn't a lot of violence actually going on at that point in time. When this suddenly happens, you now have regional stability come right back to the forefront of what do we do now? And so for many, a capitulation, if they would use those terms, others would say this is a pragmatic realism that accepting Jilani as the leader in order to maintain regional stability and not return to a state of violence, is that an acceptable thing? Is that a way that we can, move forward by accepting this man as the quasi leader? He is not in a 100% stable situation because he has 30 days to have a shared government within Syria. And there's just so much going on here. It's almost impossible to put into, just even a short, interview like this.
Bringing it back to the now and the future. Again, looking at American interests. What's our American interest? How does this impact our country, our security? Because we know Middle Eastern conflicts or any conflicts that occur in the Middle East don't generally stay in the Middle East. They export to other parts of the globe. So how do we guard against that? And more importantly, what does it represent to our military?
This is a fairly interesting theory on what actually happened here, and this will take me into what U.S. interests are and how this can affect our military. There is belief that Turkey was actually informed and knew about what was going to happen before it did. Immediately, the U.S. targeted on the very next day, the day after, they had 70 targets that they were hitting in Syria against ISIS in the north. If you look at Israel, they were doing the same, moving into the Golan Heights. And so, with this is not a spontaneous reaction. And if you actually look at U.S. military organization, you can't launch that quickly without planning. And so, in that respect, there are people who believe that this was coordinated ahead of time, and because of the reaction to that. What the United States is going to be heavily focused on right now, and the U.S. military specifically, is one, understanding who are the stakeholders in Syria, who are the main stakeholders in the region, and what is their interest of involvement, and what is that interest of involvement is going to be. Syria is an interesting category, mainly because its importance due to its geographical location. You have the Iran troops in there. You have Turkish troops in there, Kurdish troops in there, Russian troops in there. You've got American presence in there. And you have the winners and you have the losers. All of these people are also border countries to Syria. And so it becomes extremely important to all of them as to what is actually going to happen. Now, what we see here and what everybody probably knows well about is that immediately after this occurred, incoming President Donald Trump tweeted out in all caps that he was going to completely withdraw and have nothing to do with Syria. And the U.S. presence was going to be removed from the region. That could also be extremely problematic, especially to the Kurds, because the U.S. has unilaterally supported the Kurdish factions that are actually there in the north. But this is what's going to happen. The best way to describe this from a military perspective, what they would say and what they would actually call it, the term that was used, and you've probably heard this before, is this is basically a wicked problem of what is going on from the U.S. perspective. U.S. has a very large presence that is quasi non-military in the Middle East. That Middle Eastern states still very much heavily support. This will also apply with regard to the way that they're looking at Syria. Because even if you pull troops out, there is the potential, and I believe that this is what incoming President Trump is going to try to do, is rather than deal with it with boots on the ground militarily, getting into another nasty fight, that he will approach it from a diplomatic and economic stance to the country. Syria is economically devastated. They have to rebuild. They have already tried to start opening schools. They have tried to restart getting internet back up for individuals. For refugees who are returning home, their homes are devastated completely. There's just nothing there. And so the economic diplomatic side of this may have a more stable outcome. However, that stable outcome economically may then also put ethnic minorities at risk. And so it's like you're playing the game. What card is going to be played that is going to bring that regional stability? Also very important to the U.S. presence in the Middle East. And here I will go to a quotation that if you were watching the panel that I sent you, you probably may have seen. And this is from Dr. Majid Al-Ansari. And I will say that I'll actually quote him specifically. He says, "We are not shy about asking the U.S. because we believe in the strategic partnership and the strategic presence of the U.S. in this part of the world. Stability and security in the Middle East is dependent on U.S. engagement, U.S. understanding, and an open dialogue between us and the United States over the future of our region."
And for our audience's benefit, can you explain who the Dr. Rashid is?
He
I'm
is
sorry, I
the
mispronounced
advisor.
his name.
He is advisor to the foreign minister of Qatar.
Now, the U.S. has bombed the northern part of Syria and parts of, I'm sorry, central part of Syria. And the reasons why Israel said that they bombed Syria and the U.S. has bombed Syria is because they want to prevent the weapons of mass destruction, like the biological and chemical weaponry that Assad had in his armaments or in his arsenals, from falling into the hands of undesirables, people who will then use it against the people of the land, or worse, export
Mhm.
terror. Can you talk a little bit about that and the vital strategic interest of what Israel and the U.S. are doing when it comes to bombing Syria?
2017, the U.S. carried out its first direct military action against Assad's forces. And what they were looking at is the red line that President Obama drew was the use of chemical weapons that were there. And so this was very much a concern under the Assad regime. And when you have the downfall of Assad, who flees the country, you have a immediate thought from the players: who is going to get a hold of those weapons? And this is a big issue because the U.S. faced this issue in its withdrawal from Afghanistan. Is that they did get a hold of the weapons that had been left behind. And so when you are working with these types of groups and individuals, this is very much in the forefront of Israel's actions against what they're doing and the United States. Is when they started bombing, we left and vacated weapons. We have to keep these from getting into the hands of people that we do not want to have them. Very specifically, you have 7, 8, 9 different proxy groups in Syria who came, as a coalition together. They never really, came to finally, move this forward. And that is that cautiousness that is there. Is that what do we then do in this situation? Now, what you can say, let me finish this. What you can say is what Israel is doing there is, at first and foremost, attempting to protect their borders from ISIS. And so the UN has condemned their movement into the Golan Heights as invasion of sovereign territory, but they do have an interest in protecting their borders from ISIS and from other players who might be there. That is a big reason why they may have immediately started bombing into that area. The same with the United States, also immediately bombing there. And so with this, that is still going to be the two main words is security and stability. And for Israel, their stability, or their perceived stability, comes from removing Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah, such as Hamas, the Shia minority interests that are actually in Syria as well.
Middle Eastern country leaders are saying that they want the Americans to be present, but they don't want us to be overly heavily handed, and they militarily wise. And they also want us to be present in the region and put pressure on Israel to slow down their offensive. But again, that puts the U.S. in a very, very precarious situation. I will say that it's been pointed out that the Middle Eastern countries and leaders, influencers, have to, it's been expressed by their own people and the Americans as well, and our allies, that it's up to them to curtail the actions of proxies groups, Iran and their proxy groups.
Well, let me address the nuclear question first. Is that the Iran? Let me back up a little bit. When President Obama had entered into the JCPOA with Iran, that allowed inspection of the nuclear facilities. It was agreements made to limit their nuclearization, except for energy. When President Trump came in 2016, he immediately came out of the JCPOA and imposed very heavy sanctions on Iran. I believe that sanction forward diplomacy with Iran, or actions towards Iran, will continue. But that in turn may instigate, but what that or should I say what that has done, is it's removed our governance of observation over Iran and its nuclear arsenal, or what could be a nuclear arsenal that is there. So that is going to be and continue to be a problem with them. Is there's no oversight really as to what Iran is actually doing. Now, with regard to the U.S. presence in the Middle East, one of the things, going back to the first person, that I very much saw is I had a very unique opportunity to be both in the room, in the forum, with scholars, analysts, journalists who had a very specific perspective on the United States presence in the area. Wasn't always positive. You also, and there's a discord between what the public sees and is wanting the U.S. presence to be, and what the states see and wanting the U.S. presence to be. Most people, when they think about the presence of the United States militarily in the Middle East, it is boots on the ground, guns in hand. What a lot of people don't understand is what they are talking about with the Qataris when they're talking about this stability is it goes much, much deeper than that from people that rarely get attention, who are there as a U.S. presence militarily, working with the leaders and commanders of the militaries in Iraq, in Oman, in Kazakhstan, in these areas, Saudi Arabia, who are working behind the scenes in capacity building and border security to assist Middle Eastern countries to literally teach sometimes how to create and work with their own military doctrines, their own military missions. And this work is peacekeeping work because what they're doing is bolstering the capacity building of these nations to be able to secure themselves without the presence of U.S. boots on the ground and guns in hand. And there is where you do have an agreement between the public and the state, is that nobody wants the wars to continue. So we have to approach this from a different aspect. And the diplomacy there is engaging and assisting so that individual states can then work with what they then have the capacity to do without necessarily so heavily relying on the presence of the U.S. military. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. You know, so do we have, does the U.S. have something to fear um, um, for our safety, broadly speaking?
Of course. No, we can never 100%, we're not going to lower that potential risk. It cannot be lowered yet. If you go, let's go all the way back for just a moment to the end of World War II. And what I very much focus on in my writing is the application of the Truman Doctrine to security assistance in the Middle East. And the main reason and focal point of why the United States was there, which of course, to prevent Soviet incursion into the region and protect oil interests in the region. Technically, that hasn't really changed. We may not use the word Soviet anymore, but U.S. interests very much rely on two fronts, well, actually three if you want to look at it this way: Iran, ISIS, and the continued construct of not wanting a heavy Russian influence in the Middle East. And so this is a three-fronted diplomatic issue of dealing with ISIS, still dealing with Iran, and also dealing with Russia and what Russia wants to do and what their influence is actually going to be. So, you can say, and incoming President Trump can say, I absolutely want to take everybody out of Syria. What are the chances of that actually happening? Probably fairly slim. Because until you have an absolute 100% stable capacity, we cannot let our guard down. And it would be, in error to actually let our guard down with what could happen. So this is why the U.S., comes in and is saying we don't want these weapons to come out of our hands. And they're going to need assurances that those weapons will not be used. this is one of the other major discussions that usually goes on at the Doha Forum. And we had the first full-time one on last year was the use of autonomous lethal weapons, the use of drones, and these emerging capacity and weapons. How should these things be regulated? How should they be used or not used? And can the safety parameters that are put on them, and that also is going to reduce our ability to say we can let our guard down with what is going on. Now,
Yeah.
we're looking at Russia and Asia, where you really are dealing with cyber war. When we're looking at the Middle East, we are still dealing with a lot of physical war that is going on. So no, that guard cannot be let down.
Will Al-Jalani or Sharad, as he's calling himself now by his birth name, will he be allowed to live as a moderate leader in the Middle East? It's a big question.
I don't think anybody can quite yet answer that question. But what we are looking at is the winners, and we're looking at the losers, and we're looking at how are they going to react, what are they going to do, what are their, what are they going to be wanting to see happen, and how will then people then react to facilitate what they want to see happen.
So the title of the book that's forthcoming in 2025
Yes.
is I Hope to Return One Day. The United States Air Force, Iran. So why don't you restate the name of your book and let's talk a little bit about it real quick.
Okay, well, I hope to return one day. The United States Air Force, Iran, and the cost of a Cold War friendship. The book is it's a case study in U.S. foreign policy between the United States and Iran between 1976 and 1980. But what I'm not looking at is what is going on in Iran, the hostage crisis, or that. What the book covers is the relationship from 1941 all the way through 1980 between the United States military and Iran, and the fact that we trained a good portion of the Iranian military, and especially the Iranian Air Force, in the United States, as they were our greatest ally in the Middle East. It is an analysis that is built around the human story of the Iranian pilots who trained in the United States at American Air Force bases, lived in American communities, who end up in a very precarious limbo after the Iranian Revolution as being both friends to the US and Iran to enemies of both the US and Iran. They went from being seen as heroes in Iran as to potential enemies because this was the Shah's Air Force. The title of the book comes from a quotation from an Iranian pilot who was stationed in Columbus, Mississippi, when he was getting ready to go home before the revolution, that he was saying that he would hope to be able to return to the United States to come visit one day. That now has a double meaning for the Iranians who escaped the country after the revolution, and many of the pilots who also escaped the country, a lot of them after flying in the Iran-Iraq War, that they hope to be able to return to Iran one day. But they cannot at this time because they are now that is refugee diaspora that is in the United States, and most of them live here. I have interviewed Iranian pilots around the world, as well as American instructor pilots, American commanders, and I'm just telling the story of the United States Air Force relationship with Iran and the individuals involved that were in that. I have been working in conjunction with the United States Air Force, AETC at Randolph Air Force Base, and as well at Lackland Air Force Base. And so working in conjunction with them, I've been given access to materials that have not been used in publication before. And so with all of that put together, we are hoping for a very strong book, very readable, but also entertaining, with the stories that run everything from dating situations to murders to arguments over tickets for driving their Camaros too fast in Texas.
Dr. Anna Caney, we can't thank you enough for sharing your time, sharing your experiences, and more important, sharing your expertise. To the Millers, Michael Grant Miller, Miami's Community News team, to our producer behind the scene, Rachel Brummage. We can't thank you enough. To you, the audience. We're here for you. Drop us a line. Let us know. You can find us on all podcast platforms under Bets and Badges or at Bets and Badges. And if you don't get it, it's Bets and Badges. Thank you. Look forward to speaking next time. Bye.